Thank you very much. Welcome back. And welcome to Climate and Nature in Concert. Climate change and nature loss are business-induced, heartfelt crises that link simultaneously and accelerate towards a tipping point of irreversible systemic change. Nature loss is occurring as a result of climate change through flood, fire, and nature loss in its turn is driving climate change as damaged ecosystems lose their ability to act as carbon sinks. To rescue the climate, we must regenerate nature. There is no time to waste. We must act this decade at a scale and at a pace. One saving grace is that there are many solutions that will contribute toward both goals. I'd like to thank our session sponsor, Mark McDonald. And speaking with us today, the first, our moderator, Amanda Sturgeon, who doesn't need any introduction because I think this is your third panel for today. The author of our paper this morning around place-based net zero. Amanda is the head of regenerative design at Mark McDonald and is based in Sydney. The former CEO of International Living Future Institute, my goodness. She spent a decade creating regenerative frameworks such as the Living Building and Community Challenge programs, scaled the organisation globally and created a global movement around biophilic design. Joining Amanda on the stage today is Laura Rutterford, a director at Pollination Group. Laura's work focuses on opportunities in the nature-based solution space and the emerging international discourse around nature-related risk and opportunities that have risen to prominence following the launch of the Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures. Professor Owen Nevin, the CEO of Western Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, is an experienced conservation biologist and research leader with an international experience in the higher education research programs. He has a track record of working with industry, government and research communities to deliver programs that address science knowledge gaps. And finally, Alison Rowe, who needs no introduction from the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, as our outgoing chair and the managing director of the Nature Conservancy Australia. Alison has a wealth of experience from across the environmental sustainability field, spanning more than 16 years with a fundamental passion for nature. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. As Patrick said, I'm Amanda Sturgeon, and I'm excited to moderate this wonderful panel today. We are going to explore the importance of nature in the climate crisis, the importance of climate in the biodiversity crisis, how those two intersect, and how we can, make clear the role that nature has in climate change as we're looking at sort of solutions such as net zero. So I thought I'd start today with each of our panelists answering a question and as a bit of an introduction to themselves and how they're thinking about this topic. So why don't we start? We'll go in order here, if you like. Laura, do you want to start with answering sort of why is nature key to climate solutions?
Great, thank you. So from my perspective, we work a lot with both the private sector and government thinking through the intersection between nature loss and climate change, I guess. And primarily that conversation for us starts from a risk perspective. And so from a financial sector space, we know that climate and biodiversity are sort of achieving top billing together these days as the two systemic risks that we face from an economic perspective. And I guess we also know and have known for a long time that nature-based solutions are a really big part of the answer to helping grapple with the climate crisis. So I think the statistic something like 30%, if properly funded, of the solution to the climate crisis could come from nature-based solutions. And I guess we can think about that in two ways. Part is in terms of mitigation, so either drawing down carbon from the atmosphere or avoiding extra carbon being released through deforestation and things like that, or we can also think about it in terms of adaptation and from sort of an infrastructure or green infrastructure perspective. I think it's part of both adaptation and mitigation, and it's definitely part of the solution to the climate crisis, and we need all of the solutions available to us, and not just technology, but also looking to nature.
So Owen, as a new escapee from Western Australia today, where the first day borders are open, do you want to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, and it's great to be travelling out of Western Australia again. Not that Western Australia is not great to be trapped in. It's been a fantastic place to be trapped for the last 2 years. I think it's really important to recognise that the nature and climate conversation really has to go hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin when we're dealing with this. From a really pragmatic and practical point of view, if you're thinking about offsetting carbon and the space that takes up, and you're thinking about conserving nature and the space that takes up, if you don't think about those together, it takes more space. And you're all involved in infrastructure projects, and you know the cost of land acquisition, and you know the constraints on land. We live on a finite planet. We've got a growing population. We need to grow food. We need to have infrastructure. We need to offset carbon. We need to conserve nature. So we need to do multiple things in the same place. So we need to be thinking about these issues together. We need to be thinking about them in a way that is not simply about business as usual plus offset, thinking about innovative approaches. The other side of that is that as climate changes and as climate impacts become greater and greater, we need more and more resilience in our systems. And people have been talking over the last 2 days in the presentations about infrastructure resilience and climate resilience as you plan your infrastructure. But you also need to plan resilience into those offset projects. So if you go to one extreme and go for a single species plantation to offset your carbon, and it just becomes just that little bit too dry or too warm for that single species, or a big wildfire goes through, you've got a bit of a problem there. That risk is not mitigated. You don't have a resilient system. Natural systems, highly diverse, resilient to impacts, are going to be more beneficial in the long term. So there's multiple reasons to take these things hand in hand, but they are inseparable topics.
So, Alison, I know there's been an astonishing amount of Australia's biodiversity that has been lost in the last 100 years in particular, and TNC is at the centre of that issue. What are your thoughts on why is nature key to climate solutions?
Yeah, well, I think we're, as the other panellists have said, we're facing both a climate crisis but a nature crisis. We are talking a lot about net zero, but we need to start talking about nature positive. So there's a baseline done in 2020 around where we are with nature, and we're in a decline. So by 2030, we actually need to be nature positive, and by 2050, replenish nature. So if I talk about what that looks like, I guess half of the world's GDP is highly dependent or moderately dependent on nature. And that's missing off most companies' P&L or balance sheet. So there's a major issue. Nature provides ecosystem services that are related to climate. So it regulates climate, distributes water, provides energy, provides food and pollination and many more ecosystems that are currently provided for free. So nature is an emerging issue that is closely linked to climate. We need a tectonic shift in capital to get to nature positive by 2030. That's going to be an extra $700 billion a year to actually tackle getting to nature positive by 2030. That will be around a whole range of solutions and mechanisms. But really when we talk about the role of nature, and as Laura said, nature has a role in reducing emissions, we can certainly reduce emissions by a third by 2030 through the restoration, conservation and better management of our wetlands, forests and nature. So it has a powerful force, but it is an eco-service that is actually missing off the world's balance sheet.
So I know for myself last year I watched David Attenborough's A Life on Earth documentary. Did anyone else watch that? Yeah, I mean, it was chronicling his 50 years of doing the work he's been doing, and was heartbreaking in that, you know, he sort of looked back at places that he went to, you know, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and he's had this amazing lens that not many people have had of, you know, seeing the destruction of nature and ecosystems and the loss of species. And but, you know, still at the end of that, he sort of displayed a message of, but we can do something about this. So I'd like to sort of ask each of you, you know, what do you think we can do? And what are the key mechanisms through which we can progress both the sort of protection of nature, the support of biodiversity in Australia, if we just sort of put our lens on nature itself for the moment, and then sort of come to talk about it as the sort of climate connection. Owen, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity in Australia for restoration. We've got a large amount of degraded, cleared landscape. Much of that is not highly productive agricultural landscape. It's cleared for grazing. It was cleared because there were clearing incentives. You had to clear land to get title to the land. There was a policy framework in place that led to a lot more clearing than would have been necessary. Until a few years ago, the highest rate of forest clearing in the world was occurring in Queensland. It's slowed a little recently, but we don't think of that. You know, as Australians, we look out and say, oh, you know, it's terrible what they're doing in the Amazon. You know, the highest rate of forest clearing was occurring in our own country. So that sounds like a really bad news story, and it is. But if you reframe that as opportunity, the opportunity to restore landscapes, to re-establish complex native vegetation on our landscapes is real. It's vast. This is a big country, so the opportunities to do things at scale with very simple regulatory change. There's only a couple of levels of, well, there's 3 levels of government and 7 jurisdictions, but so, you know, it does get a little complex, but it's not international. It's not global in its scale. When you look at large-scale conservation projects in Africa or North America, they're transboundary. European projects, transboundary. They have to be complex and difficult. Australia has an enormous opportunity to use the skills that exist in this country to do restoration at scale, to do it in a meaningful way, and to do it in a planned and joined up way across our landscapes. So I think that really sets us in a very strong position as we're sitting at the beginning of the UN decade of restoration. You know, there's a global focus on that. It'll draw down carbon, it'll restore biodiversity, it'll slow biodiversity loss, and it will enhance all sorts of ecosystem services as well, from water quality to air quality to keeping soil on the land and not flowing into our oceans. So that's where I'd start.
Yeah. Alison, what about you?
Yeah, I wrote down 4 things that I wanted to sort of talk about. So one would be at a really high level to embed ESG into the financial system. And that really is to sort of look at how we make our investments. So whether it's you who's looking at a share investment, whether it's a company looking at their assets, how do we embed ESG into the financial system? Only 1% of all of the global funds under management around the world, which is $30 trillion, is aligned to a world of 1.5 degrees. So whilst we embed ESG, we have to align it to those targets. So that would be the first thing I would do. The second would be around the reallocation of capital that I spoke about before. So 700 billion per year we need to shift to get to nature positive. And that would start with some solutions around natural infrastructure. So around coastal protection and watershedding. It would also be around green finance. There's a whole new taxonomy rolling out in the UK around green bonds. And we're working on one of the first blue bonds in the world. It would be around biodiversity offsets and adding those with a carbon offset to make a stapled unit and looking at that as a different solution. Of course, nature-based solutions that we've spoken about. looking at nature from the boardroom to the supply chain. So we've seen ESG become the topic of the month. Everyone's talking about it at the boardroom, but that has to go from the boardroom to the supply chain. Also looking at what we need to do for developing countries around aid for biodiversity, looking at budgets and policy, phasing out harmful subsidies to industries that shouldn't be there, and the role of philanthropy, which is actually really significant around the world. That's my second one. I know Laura will talk about TNFD, so I won't touch on that one too much, but just to say, to get a shadow price on your P&L, so as you're putting together an infrastructure project, have you got a shadow price for nature into your budget? And then I think the fourth one is to pay our First Nations people for managing our place. What they do around savanna burning and all the other issues around looking after country is quite phenomenal. We have the largest intact savanna in the world, and we should pay our First Nations people for looking after that, which is their livelihood. So that would be my comment.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, to turn to financing for a minute and go back to David Attenborough, where I think his quote was, as long as it's more economically feasible to destroy nature versus preserve nature, that we will keep doing it. So, Laura, I'd love you to talk a little bit about TNFD and other sort of strategies for financial incentives towards protecting nature.
I appreciate the call out to the TNFD, Alison, because I was thinking as you were running through your list that I guess that framework draws down on a lot of those themes, or it will do once it's in place. So I guess just to maybe zoom out for a minute on the sort of systems and finance issue, there's a few reports that have come out recently, and Alison referred to one of them by the World Economic Forum about the fact that 50% of our global GDP is either highly or moderately dependent on nature, and that's a really shocking fact. But shortly after that one, there was also a review commissioned by the UK Treasury called the Dasgupta Review, and at least out of Europe, that's had huge implications for how people are thinking about nature and its connection to our financial systems and the activities of both the public and the private sector. So it's an incredibly long report. I can recommend the executive summary for policymakers, but the gist is that really fundamentally we are dependent on nature for everything that we do. And we need to start taking that into account on our balance sheet, as Alison has said. So we can't kind of ignore the environment and put it in a box over here anymore and go about our daily lives. We really have to fundamentally shift the way we think about this issue. And so rolling out of that and off the back of the success of the Taskforce on climate-related financial disclosures, there's a really big push at the moment around something called the Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures. And if you're familiar with the TCFD, it's not, I guess, a huge leap to start thinking about what the TNFD is going to require. It will follow a really similar format to the TCFD, but I guess it's a broadening of the lens. So we're talking about all of nature, and one element of that is climate. But it is also biodiversity, it's also impacts on soils and oceans, and there's a full range of things that fall into what the TNFD is going to be asking us to look at. And so like the TCFD, corporations are going to have to get their heads around what the impacts on nature are, and I think that's the key here, because we can talk about the need to shift finance and I guess think more carefully about where we should be investing. But if we don't know what the impacts are, we can't think about where to shift that finance from. Where does that money need to come from, and what's the redirection of the flow? So the TNFD is in its sort of infancy at the moment. It's about to launch a beta framework in 2 weeks' time, and there will be some brave companies that are going to trial some pilots under that framework. But really we're talking about having the framework in place by early 2023. So we've got about 12 months to kind of get our heads around what this might mean, in the same way as the TCFD has really shaped the conversation around climate risk. We need to be having that broader conversation around nature risk. And I guess the main departure of the TNFD from the TCFD framework is that it's got a dual focus. It's not just about physical risk, and I mean neither was the TCFD, but that did come through very strongly, is that was a really core focus. But the TNFD is about both physical risk and transition risk, and transition risk in this space is huge because it's about all of the ways through your entire supply chain, in this case let's say for a development, that you have impacted negatively on nature. You need to understand it, be able to report on it, and demonstrate that you've done your best to mitigate it and ultimately to compensate for that. And I think that's where some of the financial flows will start to be redirected, because if you follow that mitigation hierarchy, ultimately you probably arrive at a place where you've got some impacts that you weren't able to avoid. And so we need to think about then what's the best bang for buck in terms of investment of the compensation that you need to make for those impacts. And that's where the synergy, I think, between nature-based solutions addressing both climate and biodiversity becomes really relevant. So I might pause there on the team if they get too excited about it.
Anyone who wants to know more about it, you can come to you afterwards. So, we're seeing our planning policies, I think, often lacking in terms of preventing land clearing or development on, greenfield sites, for example, in Australia. And there's also a sort of, I think, reliance on biodiversity offsets that comes in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that mechanism for protecting Australia's biodiversity or as a protection of nature solution. Alison, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, a couple. So I think I just mentioned that we're working on the world's first blue bond with HSBC and TNC, also with New South Wales Government and Mid-Coast Council. So it's quite a good consortium. Mid-Coast Council had realised they have a number of sort of, I guess what you'd call infrastructure or blue infrastructure issues. And what they're trying to do is see, can we create a bond, just like you create a normal bond to recover the debt to pay for nature-based solutions to fix those ecosystem issues. So there's a number of projects that we've identified. There's 3 areas. One is around the threat to poor water quality, which is really from drained wetlands. The other is around river sediment, which is from the erosion of the banks in the Mid-Coast Council. And then the other is around the decline in the fish, which is actually due to physical infrastructure being put in place, and I guess less of a nursery of fish there. So those are the sort of 3 areas we're going to try and look at. Can we create this new sort of blue infrastructure bond that will actually recover the debt and operate in the financial system? So we see that as pretty exciting, and it's early days, but it's a great collaboration and partnership. So there is examples of stepping outside of the current norm and trying to think creatively about how do we use mechanisms that are already there today and bring in nature and bring in climate and all those things with it, with natural infrastructure. The other sort of way, I guess, that we've worked, and I mentioned before, around First Nations. So we've worked with 33 different Indigenous communities around helping them look at what they could do around early burns in the fire system to prevent late burns, which are actually really damaging to nature. And we've been working, started off in the Fish River in the Kimberley, and as I said, now we work with 33 different groups. And what we're doing is helping them create that framework, and now there is the methodology approved through the ACCUs that they can generate a carbon abatement credit. So that is actually a pretty fantastic outcome, and they're the premium price. When we first started working with these types of carbon credits, they were around $12. They're up around $50 a tonne now, and that money flows directly back into the Indigenous communities. So I thought I'd pull a few numbers to share, because I've been a bit numbers oriented today, which is not my normal, but over that time we've abated 1.2 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, generated $50 million of carbon credit economic prosperity back to the communities every year, which goes back to the communities, and 18 million hectares of land protected, and it has a social return of investment of 5 to 1. So for every dollar that you invest into First Nations, in terms of those carbon mechanisms, it gives it both a social, economic, cultural and environmental return. So that's a pretty fantastic return on investment. And again, that's another example of bringing what I would say is what we need to do is bring the finance system, the nature and the biodiversity issues together to try and come up with new mechanisms rather than combating and facing the old way of policy and regulation. So we're trying to set a bit of a trend there. But it's fantastic, and I know there's some new potential going around, not only around abatement but carbon sequestration, and can that be added to those types of carbon credits. We are also looking at biodiversity credits in that stapled unit that I've spoken about. There has been some work on that through South Pole, but actually how could we even have this sort of quadruple unit? So if we added carbon, we added biodiversity, we added a cultural component and a social component, I think it's the future of those types, again, of initiatives that's going to sort of pivot to what we need to. It's not long ago that I was working, one of my first jobs in the infrastructure sector was at Transurban, and we were looking at what we could do around creating a voluntary carbon offset. So I think that was 2006. Look how far we've come. It may not be, a regulated mandatory system from our government, but look how much the private sector has done around the carbon market. Can't we do something like that around a stapled unit in the biodiversity market and really solve these problems together with creativity and less reliance on the current policy setting?
And do you have some thoughts on how we align all of these offsets? Like the demand for carbon offsets is going to become, vast and insatiable, I suspect, very quickly. And what might look good for carbon from a piece of land in terms of the return it might get may not look good for biodiversity, or as you pointed out, some cultural outcomes or social outcomes. So thoughts on how we bring all of this together?
I think it was really interesting to see your presentation of the report this morning on the place-based approach to net zero and how important that place-based approach is. I think it's also really worth thinking about how much of the conversation we've been having at this conference has been around carbon, and recognizing that Laura mentioned the Dasgupta report. Its predecessor in the Stern report, also commissioned by UK Treasury, that led to TCFD. That's been a 30-year journey, 25-year journey, from Stern report to conversations like we're having today, where companies really recognize the need to account for their carbon intensity on their balance sheet and reporting it. The journey to biodiversity accountability will be much swifter, a much truncated version of the same issue. We need to get ahead of that, and we need to start planning. And that's where that place-based approach, that regional approach to understanding, how do we get the best outcomes from our infrastructure, from our offset, from our preservation, from our cultural use of landscape in this place and in this place and in this place? Because the answers will be different in different places. We can't have a single magic bullet that solves all our problems. So when you look at your project and you start to plan, you start to consider the life cycle of your project and the supply chain impacts of carbon, and you think about social procurement and local procurement and all of those things that are becoming the norm in your infrastructure project. Think that in 3 to 5 years, probably closer to 3, the biodiversity issue is going to be just as much part of that discussion. It's going to be very much front and center because it is tied to that social infrastructure. It's tied to the carbon. It's tied to the quality of life. It's tied to health. It's tied to cultural values of land. So we are in a position now where we've got an opportunity to plan and say, we are planning what we do with our offsets. We're not doing it piecemeal. This project offsets there, this project offsets there, this project carbon maximizes, that project does a stapled, stacked credit. To look at planning on a regional scale. And this is where organizations like those that you represent and work for actually have a real leg up and advantage on organizations like mine that are in the biodiversity space. We're not good at planning on a regional scale. If you're building a road network, planning on a regional scale is exactly what you do. You do that really, really well. So let's talk to each other. Let's share data. Let's share skill sets so that that infrastructure is not in conflict, development is not in conflict with the conservation agenda. It's actually working hand in glove to ensure the outcomes. It's the only way we're going to be successful in meeting this pressing challenge.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to take a place-based approach to some of these very large regional infrastructure projects, right, we would be able to have enormous impact on this regional thinking, because they could be the instigator projects to sort of start that and initiate that. So, Laura, I'm thinking too about how infrastructure can play a role here in both helping to regenerate and protect nature, but also to increase biodiversity, influence the supply chain more. You've got some thoughts on sort of where infrastructure can play a key role in this intersection between nature and climate.
Yeah, I think there's probably two parts to that answer. So I guess the first thing I'd actually kind of like to go back to is this idea about the use of biodiversity offsets in infrastructure projects. Because I mean, we've got compliance schemes in all of our states, and I think what's really interesting is that more or less they sort of pitch for no net loss as the policy outcome. But something that we're starting to see with private sector clients in the built environment, at Pollination, is that they are thinking about what is beyond no net loss. So if we accept we need to be on this journey to nature positive, and people are already really deeply thinking about what that means and looks like for their business models, no net loss isn't going to cut it, because as Alison said, Alison and Owen said we need to be achieving restoration outcomes to land at nature positive by 2030. And so that sort of begs the question of, can you have a nature positive development? Can you have net biodiversity gain? And I'm sure for many of you that's not a phrase that you're hearing here for the first time. I know that that's been around conceptually for quite a while, but it has been adopted in the UK as their policy position. So every new piece of development has to achieve a positive outcome for biodiversity, and they've said that outcome has to be an additional 10%. I guess the conversation that we're having here now is, well, if that's what sort of the baseline is coming out of Europe, it probably won't be too long before we find ourselves in a similar compliance position here. So should we be pushing the envelope? Should we already be going further? Is 10% even enough biodiversity gain, or do we need a bigger number? And so I think that has really interesting implications generally for the impact of infrastructure. If all of our infrastructure projects aimed to achieve a net biodiversity gain, I think that could be really interesting. But it also means that it's bringing forward that conversation around voluntary biodiversity offsets that I think Alison was alluding to. So if we are going to go beyond near compliance and we want to tick that extra 10% box, or let's say we're being ambitious and it's 30%, because we're operating there outside of a compliance realm, we have the ability to design what that extra 30% looks like, and that might be a voluntary type of nature-based credit, or it could just be a set-aside managed by Indigenous people. So that I think that there's a really interesting conversation to be had there about how the infrastructure sector can influence that voluntary space, and I think that that's really exciting. And then I guess the second part of the answer to that is around supply chain, so with more of a risk lens. I think we're really used to thinking about development impacts that are immediate, so the clearing of land for the piece of infrastructure that's going to be implemented. But I guess going back to the TNFD, it's going to force this thought process about the nature-related impacts all the way through the value chain. So from raw materials extraction to transportation, and it's going to be very much like the scope 1, 2, 3 discussion that we have and are very familiar with on climate. And really, I guess if we're going to apply the sort of nature positive lens to that supply chain perspective, then we need to be thinking about how we can be minimising impacts but also compensating for those impacts all the way through. And so that means that you might have a development in Australia but need to be thinking about what your impacts are in Southeast Asia or somewhere further afield, and how you can be achieving positive outcomes in that location, because unfortunately, and I'm sure you'll grapple with this all the time, but biodiversity isn't fungible in the way that carbon is. So you can't offset all of your impacts in Australia if you're sourcing raw materials from overseas. And it's just, I think we're going to have to expand how we think about those compensation measures in a way that we haven't had to grapple with for climate. And it's an interesting, but I think really positive thing to be thinking about so early in the TNFD journey.
Do you think that the fact that we have offset mechanisms in most states is actually holding us back from having more voluntary programs? This is a follow-up question, Laura.
I mean, I think that it's been the way we've framed those conversations for a long time. Is what we're aiming for in the biodiversity space is compliance, and now, like climate, we're on the journey of thinking about what actually a voluntary commitment should look like. I don't think that it's hindered that thinking, and in some ways it's actually probably helpful because at least we have a frame of reference, right? We've got a jumping off point for thinking about how we could do those things. So something I've been thinking about recently, for example, is whether or not we can leverage the infrastructure from some of those, the legal infrastructure for some of those compliance schemes into the voluntary space. There's actually nothing preventing us using some of those biodiversity credits that are created under state-based schemes in a voluntary way. It's just that it hasn't been done before. So I think actually they probably create a good frame of reference and an opportunity.
What do you think, Karen?
I think there's an opportunity for reform in the offset space. I think it's been used too much as the default to say we're going to offset that. So offsets as a sort of a jumping off point or a first option. And if you think about the mitigation hierarchy, if you were thinking about safety on site, you wouldn't just jump to we're going to compensate. Workers can die, we'll compensate their families. That's a terrible thing to say. I'm not trivializing that issue, but there's no company that would be making that decision. But there are projects where offset is treated, okay, we can't avoid that, let's just offset. I think we need to really reframe our thinking about offset. It's a necessary part of the mitigation hierarchy, but shouldn't be that first port of call.
Thoughts, Alison?
Yeah, I guess we don't talk about offsets too much at TNT. We talk about conservation, improved management and restoration. So I think I really agree with Laura that the way the infrastructure sector can really accelerate this is to look at your next project. Perhaps it might be building a new wind farm or a solar farm, and not go straight to offsets, but actually understand the materiality of that infrastructure. Is it sited on any particular type of land? Actually even understand that at the start, so you can plan for what restoration or improved management will be, and not just go straight to an offset. So we don't talk about offsets too much, but we are focused on the 30 by 30 targets, which is what Australia is also committed to, that we want to protect 30% of our land and our oceans by 2030. So Australia is about 21% of land at the moment, 45% of oceans, but questionable about the quality and the protection in the oceans. So we're doing a lot of work around restoring shellfish reefs around Australia as a practical way to demonstrate what the work is that we do. So we know that there used to be lots of oyster reefs around Australia. In fact, I think we've got lots of places named after oysters. But we've only got one reef left. We only had one reef left, and that ecosystem was on the brink of extinction. So we've now got some funding from federal government to basically rebuild these oyster reefs. One oyster filtrates a bathtub of water per day. They're pretty amazing. So they have an absolute water cleansing benefit. They bring other biodiversity and fish back and create amazing nurseries. And they're like the Uber thing is something that you could do. So we're building 13 of those around at the moment, which is a practical example of what we say is what companies and projects need to do around real biodiversity impact. Other projects that we're doing, we're looking at the role of giant kelp. So again, Australia had this amazing giant kelp, which is like really big seaweed, can grow to about 60 metres. We're down to 5% left in Australia. So we're looking at funding a program to grow back giant kelp. So it doesn't necessarily have the water purification benefits, but it actually has tourism benefits because all the sea otters sit up on top of the giant kelp, which we call the ancient forest of the ocean. And that's a tourism benefit. It does bring back fish. It creates productive fish. It actually gets rid of the urchin. So there's these multiple biodiversity benefits. So I would encourage people to remove that concept of offset from what you could actually do by your work and really think about creating these pretty amazing projects that can make really big, significant difference to Australia. As I said before, with the blue bonds, it's the first in Australia. The EU issues 51% of the world's bonds worldwide. Look at our coastline. We could be the superpower contributor of blue bonds around the world and create amazing work. So let's think about those things rather than offsets.
So moving from mitigation to adaptation, I often see a conflict in infrastructure in that it's often designed in a way that makes sure it's protected from nature. You know, it's drained properly, the water's pumped away, the walls are high enough to, you know, it's a very sort of often protective industry in how it's designed. And it strikes me that it needs a sort of shift in that thinking, and we're seeing some of that play out right now, right, with flooding and, you know, how wetlands have been drained and floodplains have been built on, or, you know, sometimes our infrastructure going right through floodplains or endangered habitats. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on, you know, how do we shift that sort of, you know, we've got to protect ourselves from nature versus we can design with, and really think about how we might do adaptation through these infrastructure projects.
Maybe I'll kick off. I think the experience that people have had during COVID lockdowns of not being able to travel has really highlighted that issue of, you know, our urban infrastructure, our urban environments separate people from nature, and people are beginning to see, you know, the value of that open space, that green space in their 1 kilometre buffer. I'm from Western Australia. I'm not familiar. 5, okay. We had a whole state. So that value that sits there, and so much of our infrastructure is exactly as you say. It's that hardening of the landscape. It's you know, getting the water to drain away as quickly as possible, and just looking at, you know, the flooding issue. I remember. It was back when I was working in the UK, head of the National School of Forestry in the UK, and we had some pretty major floods in the north of England, and they were looking for solutions post flooding. And one of the proposals that we developed and put forward was around making the river systems more sinuous, taking out field drains, and returning wet woodlands into the catchments. So this was 15 to 20 years ago, and probably ahead of its time. The solution that was implemented was an engineering solution, canalisation of the river, raising the levees, trying to get the water off the land quicker. You know, just get that water through quicker. You know, unfortunately, a decade on, or a little over a decade on, there were more major flooding events, a 1 in 1,000-year flooding event that actually washed away a lot of that infrastructure and caused major damage to the urban centres. And now the solutions that are being put in place are those nature-based solutions. People are restoring the natural flow of rivers. Things like beavers being put back, not a solution that would work in the Australian context, but in the European context, you know, putting beavers back in to create that damming of the rivers and slow the flow of those floods. So working to have, you know, a natural system rather than that hard engineering, which you just have to get more and more and more extreme as the climate conditions get more and more extreme. And we can go that way. You know, we can go more and more extreme till, you know, you reach a point where you've got completely hardened infrastructure against your seawall, and you're just making that stronger, and you're making your river more canalized. I always think of the LA River channel. You've probably all seen it in films. Some of you have seen it in person. There's a little trickle of water down the middle of it, and a giant concrete structure that runs through the middle of the city that takes all the water that, if they get snow and it melts in the Sierras, it all comes down in a rush. And there's a vast piece of infrastructure that goes straight through the city. You know, that's one approach. You just make the infrastructure big enough, strong enough to deal with the emerging crisis of the new climate. Or you step back and you start to work with nature. You start to think about landscape scale solutions. You start to think about restoring wetlands. You have oyster reefs that then break waves, reduce energy coming in, mangroves restoration. And when I was based in Queensland, we were involved in a lot of seagrass and mangrove work. And the energy that dissipates out of a storm surge, out of wave systems, is incredible. And it locks up carbon, and it's a nursery for fish, and it looks good. And what downside is there? And maybe I'm too far to one extreme, but you look at this opportunity and say, we could just keep engineering our way out of this, or we could take our smart engineering and work with nature. So you're not just going, we'll throw our hands in the air and and retreat from our coastal cities and let them go. You work with nature, you work with your smart engineering solutions, you work with data, you work with regional scale planning, and you get outcomes that don't just head down in one direction, but it's a fundamental decision at some point not to keep. The river systems are the best example I can think of, because every flood you have to make it taller, deeper, straighter, if you go down that line.
Yeah, and seeing what this week, it's 1 in 500-year floods now happening every year or two. Very different context now. Yeah, Alison, some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do think it starts with the business case. So if you haven't priced in nature and got a shadow price of the ecosystems and from the start, you'll always be playing catch up. So there's many concepts around regeneration and rewilding, but it does come down to the business case and putting a price on nature and the ecosystems at the start. And if you can start to think of a longer term rather than a short term payback, and have the right metrics within that business case, that's the start. But you're right, at the moment, as Owen said, we're sort of building it and then looking at mitigating later, and we need to start with a positive frame in the first place. I think carbon's been really easy for us as a currency for climate change. That's what we've got. But nature's going to be much more complex, and we've got a massive opportunity to start to think about that now and not pay extra costs later fixing up the damage we do by hard infrastructure.
Laura, any thoughts on this issue?
Maybe just at a high level. So I was going to talk about mangroves and reefs, but Owen beat me. I guess something that's coming up a lot at the moment in the discussions that we're having, and I think it's also been touched on in the conversation today, is around landscape resilience and the fact that we need to enhance the natural capital value of our landscapes to mitigate and minimise the risks from these natural events like flood and fire. So by improving ecosystem health and biological diversity and focusing on all of these nature-related issues at a landscape level, overall as a system, it will reduce the impacts of these types of events on the infrastructure that we're building. So part of it is about putting the infrastructure in the right place, and there are definitely people in this room that are better poised to think about than me, but we need to be thinking about that from the perspective of the fact that we're having these 1 in 500-year flood events off the back of a 1 in 100-year flood event, and we're not getting breathing room. But then also holistically, when we think about the landscape as a system, I think we need to be doing everything we can to enhance natural capital values across the board.
Right, so I'm thinking in this room it's sort of small enough where we could maybe do a couple of questions from the audience, if anyone has burning questions, before I go to closing comments. Or do you have I was like, no one gave me an iPad, so thank you. All right, so we've got some questions. Okay, so one from Justin. How do we get an increasingly urbanized population to value and understand the value of nature? Do we teach it in school? We need to galvanize and then harness that support to address the problems at scale. So it's something I hear quite a lot, is that as we become more urbanized, will we lose our connection to and our value of nature? Owen?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. And how do you get people engaging with nature? And I think sometimes we, and particularly as conservation professionals, we think too big in that space, because we think about how do I get people into the wilderness? How do I get people into that encounter with wildlife that's earth-shattering and changes their life, which is possible. And you can get people to those places, but you can't get everybody to those places, because if you get everybody to those places, they lose what they are. But there is an opportunity for us to think on a much different scale. And the questioner mentioned schools and teaching the value of nature in schools, engaging with our indigenous culture here in Australia, and the really deep engagement they have with place and with country, and engaging with nature and understanding nature through that lens brings multiple benefits. And I think it's amazing to see how the small things actually impact. It's not everybody has to go on that wilderness trip to see bears in Alaska. I told you I'd get bears. Not everybody has to have that opportunity, but seeing birds nesting on the side of your building, and watching those chicks fledge. Kids love that. They engage with it, and it's something. I've got a 6-year-old who's in primary school and comes home and tells me every day about the tadpoles that their teacher has in a tank in the classroom. The tadpoles are the most exciting thing about going to school. That's not earth-shattering, expensive, difficult to do. That's a teacher that's brought some nature into their classroom in urban Perth. We don't. We live in the city. So I think, yes, we have to engage people, but no, it's not the big challenge that it might seem, because you don't have to go all the way to the how do we get people out into the mountains. No, bring something small into the classroom.
All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left. There's a couple of these questions I think we've answered. There was one around, do we think Australia's tracking towards the protected area targets? And I know, Alison, you talked about 30 by 30 and, where we are with that. And we're not tracking towards it yet, by the sounds of it, but any further thoughts on that?
Well, we've got a big job to do, but we've done a great job as well. Mm-hmm. So, we have got 21% of Australia's land protected. It's going to require some pretty big thinking, though, to get that last 9%. So we're sort of thinking about what is that finance mechanism, because it always comes back to finance, to create a big fund to actually look at a whole range of different products and initiatives that will get us there. Mm-hmm. So one of those, as Owen said, is really important to work with First Nations, so expanding more Indigenous protected areas. We do need to look at the quality of the marine parks. So whilst they're 45% protected, it's a real issue around quality. We need to look at whether we bring the National Reserve System back for land. What do we do around private ownership? How can all of us do our part in buying some land and conserving it and restoring it? So there's a whole range of initiatives. I feel like we've got the mechanisms here, but we do need to get it front and centre, and we need to get it in a conversation that we're having a lot more. I don't know if anyone remembers the announcement by the Prime Minister when we signed up to 30 by 30. Does anyone remember? It was pretty quiet, right? So I was surprised when I saw it the next day. It was bundled with some other news, right? So we did that really quietly. But we really need to get this front and centre and think about every role that we can play in terms of different ways to protect our beautiful world and our place here. And it's something Australia can lead. Look at the size of our place. We can really do this. So I think getting it on the front part of the conversation and not hidden away under another media release or a press release is probably a good start.
Thank you. So, closing thought and question for you, Owen, and then Laura. So, do you think 30 by 30 is not ambitious enough for Australia, given the land mass and given the more recent sort of destruction of biodiversity compared with other regions of the world? Should we be aiming higher?
I think when you look at what we're aiming for and signing up to 30 by 30, as Alison pointed out, was done very quietly. A lot of these things are announced very quietly, and therefore don't get the momentum that they probably justify. Certainly looking internationally, there's a growing voice for 50% for nature. I think that's definitely something that we should be actively considering. 30 by 30 would be great. It's better than 21 by 22. But actively considering what comes beyond that. Australia, the geography of this country lends itself to a large amount of protected area because everybody lives within 70 kilometres of the coast, and there's vast amounts of land. Now, it's really important then to make sure that our 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 or whatever target we aim for is representative. It's not just let's have a whole lot of desert and develop the edge. To have a representative approach, but there should be no constraint in getting to those targets.
Laura, final thoughts on that?
I think I just sort of echo the point that the representation across rare and interesting ecosystems that sort of tend to intersect where we would like to develop. I think achieving that in that last 9% of the protected area that we need for 30 by 30 is really important and really challenging, because when you look at that land, you see the traditional economic value, I guess. So running the argument that actually we need to conserve some of that remaining habitat for nature has historically been challenging. If we could find a way to crack that, I think that would be a really good outcome for 30 by 30. But I guess one other thought I have about those sorts of protected area targets is that, we've already protected 21% of Australia's terrestrial environment, and we know that our biodiversity loss rate is shockingly bad. And so an extra 9% probably isn't going to be enough to avert that unfolding crisis. We actually also need to think about proper funding for the management of those protected areas. And, our national parks are underfunded, and if we're going to add to that sort of protected area on a national basis, we need to make sure that there are financing mechanisms, to Alison's point, that stand behind that, and make sure that on an ongoing basis we're not just putting a fence around something, but we're putting Indigenous communities back into those protected areas to manage them properly in the way that they have done for millennia. And we need to have proper plans in place for all of the threatening processes. It's not just about land clearing, it's about invasive species, and it's also about forward thinking for climate change. So we need to make sure that wherever we protect, it's the right parts of our remaining landscape, accepting that populations of flora and fauna are going to move probably quite significantly over the next 100 years and beyond because of climate change. So we need to have a sort of forward-looking lens on that as well. I think it's very complicated.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to the great questions. And we'll close the session there. Thank you.